A 5-year-old girl hadn't spoken a real sentence in 2 years, not to the doctors, not to the nannies, not even to her own father, a man whose name alone could make grown men across Boston's underworld go pale. Emmerich Langston didn't beg. He didn't negotiate. He destroyed whatever stood in his way, and at 37, he'd built an empire of ports, real estate, and blood money that stretched from Boston Harbor to Manhattan. A faded scar ran along his left jaw, and his steel-gray eyes carried the kind of cold that made seasoned FBI agents look away first. But none of that power could fix the one thing breaking him from the inside out: his daughter Bree, a ghost of a child who clutched a black cat named Shadow and whispered things no one understood. Meanwhile, sleeping under the Longfellow Bridge, with nothing but a torn jacket and 3 stray cats who'd learned to trust her, Felicity Ashford had no idea that her smile, quiet, aching, stubbornly warm, was an almost perfect mirror of a dead woman's face. She didn't know that the cat she'd throw herself in front of a truck to save on a cold October afternoon belonged to that little girl. And she certainly didn't know that the moment Bree saw her laughing in the dirt with blood on her knees and a rescued cat in her arms, the child would say the first clear words she'd spoken since her mother died. "You look so sad. You'll be my mom now, okay?" One sentence that would drag a homeless woman into a Mafia king's fortress, force a ruthless man to face the one enemy he couldn't shoot his way out of his own heart, and crack open a murder someone powerful had spent 2 years burying. But here's what nobody saw coming. Felicity wasn't just some stray they took in. She was the abandoned daughter of their greatest rival, and the secret in her blood was enough to burn both empires to the ground. If you're already hooked, smash that like button so this story reaches more people. Share it with someone who loves a good twist, and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Now, let's go back to where it all began, a freezing penthouse in Boston, where a man who feared nothing sat beside his silent daughter and realized he was running out of time. That night, the top floor of Langston Tower looked down over all of Back Bay like an eye that never blinked. Not a single light was on inside the penthouse, except for the cold blue glow from the phone screen on the desk. Emmerich stood before the glass wall, a glass of whiskey in his hand, untouched. Behind him, Finnegan Holt, a 40-year-old man with a face that looked as though it had been carved from stone and the eyes of someone who had buried men without losing sleep, was reading this week's intelligence report in a flat, steady voice, as if he were reading a grocery list. Petra Ashford had met privately with 3 minor families in Providence and 2 in Hartford over the past 10 days. She had invited them to dinner, given them gifts, and promised to share the shipping route through the port of Boston if they sided with Ashford. Worse, a source reported that Petra was secretly selling the Langston cargo ship schedules to the Moreno family in Chicago in exchange for financial backing. Emmerich didn't turn around. He asked only one question, his voice low, like the sound of a blade scraping across glass. "This is the 3rd time, isn't it?" Finn understood what he meant. Yes, Petra Ashford had just sent a 3rd political marriage proposal through her lawyer, along with an analysis of the benefits of merging the 2 empires if Emmerich agreed to marry her. Emmerich set the whiskey glass down on the table, and the sound of glass touching marble rang dry and hard through the dark room. "Tell her lawyer that the next time any more papers are sent to my office, I'll return them with the messenger's finger attached." Finn nodded without blinking, then moved on to the matter they both knew mattered more than anything else: the Cordelia case. Emmerich turned around for the first time that evening. His eyes changed, going from cold to something deeper, darker, like the bottom of a well with no water in it. Finn spoke plainly. After 2 years of investigation, they knew for certain that the car that caused the accident that night hadn't been an ordinary car. The license plate was fake, the traffic camera footage had been erased within 24 hours, and there had been at least one call from inside the Ashford family to the only witness before that person disappeared. But it still wasn't enough. Not enough to point directly to the person who had given the order. Emmerich said nothing more. He walked out of the study, down the dark hallway to the end of the floor, where his daughter's bedroom door stood slightly open and the nightlight cast a weak yellow strip across the wooden floor. Bree was sitting in the middle of the bed, her tiny legs folded beneath the blanket, holding Shadow in her arms. The black cat was curled up, its tail wrapped around the little girl's wrist like a living bracelet. Bree's eyes were wide open, staring at a corner of the wall where there was nothing, her mouth moving with words no one could quite hear. Mrs. Pemberton stood outside the door, both hands clasped tightly in front of her stomach, her face heavy. She spoke softly, just loud enough for Emmerich to hear. "She wouldn't eat dinner, sir. She's been sitting like that since 6 o'clock in the evening, saying over and over that the sky is burning and Shadow needs to go find the rain." She stopped, swallowed, then continued with the thing she had been trying to delay all week. "Dr. Whitfield called this afternoon. He said that if Bree doesn't show clear progress in the next 6 months, he'll formally recommend moving her to a specialized care facility in Connecticut. He used the words, full-time therapeutic environment." Mrs. Pemberton didn't dare look Emmerich in the eye as she said it. She had lived inside the Langston family for 30 years, had seen men carried out of this mansion in body bags, but she had never feared anything the way she feared this moment. Emmerich didn't answer her. He stepped into the room and sat down on the edge of his daughter's bed. Bree didn't look up. She was still staring at the corner of the wall, her hand stroking Shadow's fur in a steady, lifeless rhythm. Emmerich reached out and took his daughter's tiny hand. Bree's hand was ice cold. His own hand, the hand that had once pulled a trigger without trembling, was shaking. He sat there, in silence, beside the daughter he was willing to burn the whole world down to protect, yet couldn't reach, even though she was only an arm's length away. When Mrs. Pemberton closed the bedroom door, she heard Emmerich's voice drift out, low and slow, each word as heavy as stone. "Anyone who touches my daughter, I'll bury them." Less than 5 miles away, while Emmerich Langston sat beside his daughter's bed with trembling fists, a 27-year-old woman was waking beneath Longfellow Bridge, with dew soaking her back and the smell of moss from the Charles River breathing against her face. Felicity Ashford opened her eyes, saw the dull, gray autumn sky through the gaps between rusted steel beams, and for the first few seconds, before consciousness could catch up with her, she thought she was back in the old apartment in Dorchester, where her mother used to lie on the worn floral sofa and cough until the tissues were stained red. But her mother was dead. It had been 2 years. Lorraine Ashford, or rather Lorraine, who had never been allowed to carry the Ashford name, had drawn her last breath from late-stage lung cancer in that miserable apartment on a March night, when Felicity was 25 years old and holding her mother's hand, listening to each breath grow thinner and thinner, like a thread about to snap. Before she died, her mother said one thing Felicity wished she hadn't said. "Your father is Byron Ashford. He lives in Beacon Hill. He owes you." Felicity had gone looking for him. She had stood before the iron gates of the Ashford estate with worn-down heels and her birth certificate in her hand, thinking that blood was still blood after all. Petra Ashford, her half-sister, 30 years old, in a white lace dress with a smile so sweet Felicity had believed it, welcomed her into the house as though welcoming a long-lost sister. 6 months. For 6 months, Felicity was allowed to stay in a guest room meant for senior servants, was fed properly, was called by her name. She thought it was family. Then, one morning, Petra called her down to the grand hall. The entire household staff stood in 2 lines. On the table, the family matriarch's diamond necklace had been placed beside a photograph from the security camera, showing Felicity opening Petra's jewelry cabinet to retrieve her mother's old shawl, which Petra had secretly taken and hidden there. But in the photograph, the camera angle had been cropped just enough to make it look as if Felicity were reaching into the diamond drawer. Petra said in front of everyone, her voice as clear as church bells, that she was heartbroken that her own sister was a thief, and that her father had been right never to acknowledge this child. Byron Ashford was sitting in the room next door. He heard everything. He didn't come out. Felicity was escorted to the gate by 2 large men. But before she stepped across the threshold, Petra called her back. She was holding Milo, the little black cat Felicity's mother had given her 3 days before she died, the cat that had slept on Felicity's pillow for 2 years, the only cat in the world that knew what hour Felicity cried every night. Petra stroked Milo's head and smiled. "Want him back? Then kneel, right here, in front of everyone." Felicity looked at Milo. Milo looked back at her with his round golden eyes. She wanted to kneel. God, she wanted to kneel so badly her knees had already begun to bend, but she heard her mother's voice in her head, the voice 2 years of sickness hadn't managed to erase. "Don't ever kneel before anyone, Fel." She straightened her back, turned around, and walked out into the rain. The iron gate closed behind her. She didn't look back. That was the last time she saw Milo. A year had passed since that day. Now, beneath Longfellow Bridge, Felicity sat up on the damp sheet of cardboard, pulled from the pocket of her torn coat a piece of bread she had begged for yesterday afternoon from the bakery on Charles Street when they were throwing out the day's leftovers. 3 stray cats were already sitting around her, waiting. 1 calico, 1 yellow cat so thin its bones showed, and 1 gray cat missing half of its left ear. They had no names. They didn't belong to her, but they came every morning, and she gave them their share before taking her own, because it was the only thing she could still do that made her feel she was still human. She broke the bread into 3 pieces, placed them on the ground, watched them eat, and smiled. A smile with no reason, no audience, and no meaning beyond itself. Then her phone vibrated. The battered old Nokia flip phone she had found in a trash can last month had no data and only received messages when she stood close enough to a cell tower. The small blue-green screen lit up with 2 lines of text. Dear Sister Felicity. Saturday night, Ashford Compound, Beacon Hill, dress as a server. Come, and I'll give you news about Milo. Signed, Petra. Felicity stared at the screen until it went dark by itself. She knew it was a trap. She knew Petra was never kind to anyone without a reason. She knew stepping through that gate again meant placing herself under the heel of the woman who had taken everything she had. But Milo. She closed her eyes and saw those round golden eyes looking back at her from Petra's arms. She opened her eyes, slipped the phone into her pocket, and didn't delete the message. 2 days before that party, on Thursday afternoon, Boston Common stretched beneath the weak October sunlight like a candle flame about to go out, red and yellow maple leaves drifting slowly down over the old brick paths. Mrs. Pemberton took Bree to the park as she did every afternoon, with 2 bodyguards in black suits walking behind them, looking like 2 stones that had learned how to move, their eyes sweeping constantly with the habit of people who lived in a world where a bullet could come from any direction. Bree sat on a stone bench near the great lawn, holding Shadow in her lap, her small legs swinging without touching the ground. She was saying something to the cat, her voice as soft as wind slipping through leaves, the kinds of sentences Mrs. Pemberton had heard hundreds of times and never once understood. Shadow lay curled up, his golden eyes half closed, his tail wrapped around Bree's wrist as always. Then the ambulance siren tore the afternoon open. The sharp, piercing sound rushed from the direction of Boylston Street and sliced through the autumn air like a knife. Shadow sprang out of Bree's lap, all 4 paws hitting the ground, and bolted before anyone could react. The black cat raced across the grass, slipped under the low iron fence, and vanished toward the Tremont Street exit, where traffic was moving without pause. Mrs. Pemberton screamed his name. The 2 bodyguards immediately ran after him, but Shadow was too fast and too small. He darted between pedestrians' legs and disappeared into the moving traffic like a drop of black ink dissolving into water. Bree stood up from the bench. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She stood motionless, both hands still held in the shape of the cat who was no longer there, her eyes opened so wide that Mrs. Pemberton could see the whites surrounding all of her gray irises. The woman had seen that look once before, 2 years earlier, when Bree stood in the hospital and stared at the white sheet covering her mother's face. It was the look of a child watching the world collapse without having enough words to name what was happening. Mrs. Pemberton knelt and wrapped her arms around Bree, but the little girl had gone rigid as a statue, her eyes still fixed on the direction where Shadow had disappeared. At the same time, on the eastern edge of the park near the intersection of Tremont and Beacon, Felicity was sitting on the cold concrete steps, breaking the last piece of bread for the gray cat missing half of its ear, the one she still met every day. She saw him, a jet-black Bombay cat, his fur sleek and glossy, clearly a house cat and not a stray, was running in panic across the sidewalk toward the intersection. A truck was rolling forward in the inside lane. Felicity didn't think. She didn't have time to think. Her body acted first, as if every protective instinct she had buried inside herself for the past year had suddenly found somewhere to pour out. And then, when it was all over, she sat there on the sidewalk, the thin fabric over her right knee torn open and bleeding, both arms wrapped around the trembling black cat in her lap. Shadow burrowed his head against her chest, his heart beating wildly. Felicity pressed her cheek to his head, stroked his fur with cold fingers, and whispered as though she were speaking to Milo, as though all the black cats in the world were one, were hers, and needed her to protect them. "You're all right now. No one's going to hurt you anymore," she smiled. It wasn't a wide smile. It wasn't a smile meant for anyone to see. It was only the slight lift of the corner of her mouth, her eyes closing, her thin face suddenly softening like still water after a storm. The smile of someone who had lost everything and still found a reason not to forget how to smile. And that was when Bree ran to her. The little girl had run. No one knew when she had started running, because Mrs. Pemberton was calling the bodyguards and those two large men were searching frantically toward Tremont. But Bree had run, her tiny feet in white leather shoes racing over dry leaves, running toward the direction where Shadow had vanished, as if she could hear the cat calling when no one else could. Bree stopped about 3 steps away from Felicity. The first bodyguard had just caught up and stood behind the little girl, breathing hard. But Bree didn't look at Shadow. She looked at Felicity. She looked at the woman with tangled hair, dirty clothes, and a bleeding knee. The woman who was holding her cat and smiling. That smile. Bree hadn't seen that smile in 2 years. Not on the face of any nanny, not on the face of any doctor, not on her father's face. A smile that was warm without needing a reason, sincere without asking for anything, gentle like the hand that used to stroke her hair every night before darkness fell and before her mother had ever gone away. Like her mother, warm and real, Bree stood there, with her father's gray eyes and a pain her father didn't know how to heal, and looked at the strange woman as though the whole 2 years of silence had only happened because she had been waiting for this exact smile. Bree stepped forward. 1 step, 2 steps, 3 steps. Then she opened her mouth and spoke, clearly, coherently, 1 word at a time, the sentence you heard at the beginning of this story. That sentence fell into the October afternoon like a stone dropping onto the surface of a lake that had been frozen for 2 years, and the cracks spread in every direction. Mrs. Pemberton, the 58-year-old woman who had lived inside the Langston family for 30 years and had never cried before anything, lifted a hand to cover her mouth and let out a sob she couldn't control. The first bodyguard stood right behind Bree, frozen, his hand already raised to touch the little girl's shoulder but stopping halfway, as if he were afraid that any movement might shatter the miracle that had just happened. The second bodyguard, standing a few steps away, had already taken out his phone without anyone needing to tell him. Felicity sat on the sidewalk, her knees still bleeding, her arms still wrapped around Shadow, and stared at the child in front of her without understanding what was happening. She only saw a little girl about 5 years old, with eyes gray as steel but shining with tears, looking at her with a gaze Felicity had never seen in anyone before, the gaze of someone who had just found something they thought they had lost forever. She didn't know who Bree was. She didn't know this child hadn't spoken a proper sentence in 2 years. She only knew those eyes needed something from her, and she didn't know how to refuse a child. Shadow gave a small meow, recognizing his owner, and squirmed in Felicity's lap. Bree took 1 more step, sank down beside Felicity on the dirty sidewalk, not caring that her white dress was touching the ground, and placed her hand on Shadow's head. 4 hands on 1 cat, 2 tiny clean hands, and 2 thin, dirty hands. And in that moment, none of them needed to say anything more. The second bodyguard had finished the call. He spoke into the phone in a voice even the hardest man couldn't keep from shaking. "Boss, you need to come to Boston Common right now," Miss Bree just spoke. "For the first time in 2 years, sir." 20 minutes later, 2 black SUVs pulled hard against the curb on Tremont Street, so fast the tires screeched against the damp asphalt. Emmerich stepped out before the engine had fully shut off, his stride long and quick. But when he saw what was happening on a stone bench 30 steps away, his feet stopped dead in the middle of the grass. Bree was sitting beside a strange woman on the bench. That woman looked as though she had just been hit by a car, her clothes torn, her knee covered in dried blood, her brown hair tangled. But she was talking to Bree, and Bree was answering. Not the meaningless murmurs Emmerich had heard thousands of times. Bree was speaking, and the woman was listening. And when Bree said Shadow liked eating clouds because clouds looked like cotton, the woman didn't correct her, didn't look at her with worried eyes, didn't try to drag her back to reality the way every doctor and nanny had done before. She tilted her head, thought about it seriously, and replied that morning clouds were probably better because they were lighter and still damp with dew. Bree nodded, the corner of her mouth lifting, and Emmerich saw it. The smile. Tiny, only the faintest curve at the edge of her lips. But it was his daughter's first smile in 2 years. For 2 years, he had paid hundreds of thousands of dollars to the best psychiatrists, hired nannies who had graduated from prestigious universities, bought every toy and book and musical instrument any child could want, and Bree hadn't smiled. Now she was smiling on a stone bench with a homeless woman he had never met. Emmerich stood in the middle of Boston Common, the soles of his $1,200 leather shoes pressing into rotting leaves, and for the first time in his life, he didn't know what the next step was. He approached. Finn followed close behind, but Emmerich lifted his hand, signaling him to stop. He walked alone, stopped in front of the stone bench, and looked down at the woman looking up at him. She recognized it immediately. Not who he was, but what kind of man he was. The suit, the other men in suits standing at a distance, the pressure of power radiating from him like heat from a furnace. Her eyes widened, the survival instinct of someone who had lived on the streets long enough to know when to run. But Bree was holding her hand, and she didn't pull away. "What's your name?" Emmerich's voice was low, not a question, but a command. "Felicity. Felicity Ashford." The surname fell into the space between them like metal, striking metal. Ashford, the name of the family that might have killed his wife. The name he had spent the past 2 years turning over every stone to find evidence against. The name Finn had reported only last night was trying to build alliances against him. Emmerich didn't blink. Not one muscle in his face shifted by even a millimeter. But behind his steel-gray eyes, the machine of calculation had begun to turn, fast and cold and precise. Then Bree looked up at her father, still holding Felicity's hand, and said in a clear voice, "Daddy, she knows how to talk to clouds." Emmerich looked at his daughter, looked at Felicity, looked back at his daughter. Then he spoke slowly, one word at a time, his voice carrying no emotion Felicity could read. "Ashford. Interesting." 2 days after that afternoon at Boston Common, Felicity stood before the iron gates of the Ashford compound on Beacon Hill for the first time since her exile, and both her arrival then and her return now had been for the wrong reason. The first time she had come because she believed blood meant family. This time, she came because of a cat. Night had fallen, yellow light from inside the estate spilling through the leafless oak trees, live music drifting faintly through the glass doors, and a long line of luxury cars dropping guests before the stone steps. The Ashford family's annual charity gala, the event Boston's upper class stood in line to get invited to, where hands wearing diamonds lifted glasses of champagne and traded $1,000,000 agreements beneath the cover of donations for poor children. Felicity didn't go in through the main entrance. She went around to the rear kitchen door where an event manager handed her a cheap black server's uniform, the kind made from thin polyester that clung to sweat and never let it go, along with a white apron and a short set of instructions. Carry trays, keep her head down, don't speak to guests unless spoken to. Felicity put on the uniform in a shared changing room with the outsourced catering staff, tied her hair neatly at the nape of her neck, looked at herself in the mirror, and didn't recognize the person looking back. A year ago, she had walked out of this gate in the rain, her back straight, refusing to kneel. Tonight, she had returned dressed like a servant. Because of Milo. Only because of Milo. She stepped into the grand hall with a silver tray in her hands, her eyes lowered, and the Ashford compound opened before her like the jaws of a beast plated in gold. Crystal chandeliers, black and white marble floors, oversized oil paintings hanging on the walls, and hundreds of faces from Boston's circle of power laughing, talking, and sipping wine in tuxedos and evening gowns worth a whole year of Felicity surviving on the streets. She carried the wine tray among them, and no one looked at her. She was a ghost in the middle of the party, invisible in exactly the way Petra wanted her to be. Then Petra came. She appeared from the direction of the main staircase in a tight red gown, her black hair curled in waves, a string of pearls around her neck that Felicity recognized at once, because it was the same string her mother had once said belonged to her grandmother, but Byron had taken it and given it to his official wife. Petra walked straight toward Felicity, her 3.5-inch heels striking the marble one click at a time, like a countdown. She stopped in front of Felicity, tilted her head, looked her up and down, then reached out and lifted Felicity's chin with 2 fingers, the way someone lifted a dog's muzzle to check its teeth. That uniform suits you, sister. Right where you belong. Felicity swallowed. She didn't pull her face away. She stood still, looked straight into Petra's eyes, and asked the only question she had come here to ask. "Where's Milo?" Petra smiled lightly, turned, slipped her arm through Felicity's as if they were close friends, and led her through the crowd of guests. And as they walked, she stopped beside each group, introducing Felicity in that sweet voice where only someone who knew Petra could hear the blade hidden inside it. "Everyone, this is my sister, my half-sister. My father had moments of poor judgment, but family is family, isn't it?" Polite laughter came from a few people. Pitying looks came from a few others, and open contempt came from the rest, not even hidden. Felicity carried the wine tray, dressed as a server, dragged around by her own sister like an animal being paraded in a circus, and she endured it. She endured it because of Milo. When Petra finally led her to a corner of the room where fewer people passed, Felicity asked again, her voice low, her hand gripping the edge of the silver tray so tightly her knuckles turned white. "Where's Milo, Petra?" "You promised." Petra tilted her head, as if trying to remember, then her smile widened, and Felicity knew, right before Petra opened her mouth, that she had been fooled again. "That ugly cat? Oh, I gave it away. To whom again? Or maybe it died. I don't remember, sister. It's been so long. Who remembers a cat?" Felicity stood still. She couldn't hear the music anymore. She couldn't hear the laughter anymore. She couldn't hear anything except the rush of blood in her ears and the sound of something inside her chest breaking, dry and silent, like a rotten branch snapping beneath snow. Milo, the last thing left of her mother. The last thing. Gone. Petra watched her standing there, watched her with eyes Felicity now understood had no bottom at all, then lifted a glass of red wine from the tray Felicity was holding, slowly raised it level with Felicity's face, and threw it. Red wine splashed out, spreading across the black and white chest of Felicity's uniform like blood flowing from a wound without a knife. A few drops struck her chin, her neck, and rolled downward. The grand hall went silent for one beat. The people standing close had seen it. A few turned their faces away. A few gave a mocking little laugh, the small, quick sound of people who were used to watching others be humiliated and didn't feel the need to do anything about it. Petra placed the empty glass back on Felicity's tray, patted her shoulder lightly the way someone patted a server, then turned on her heel and walked back into the crowd. Felicity stood there, red wine soaking cold through the fabric of her uniform, sliding slowly down her stomach, and she didn't cry, she didn't kneel. She stood there, both hands still holding the silver tray, her back still straight, and inside her everything was burning. The main doors of the grand hall opened, and the air in the room changed before anyone had time to turn and look. It was the kind of feeling people who had lived long enough in this world learned to recognize with their skin, not their eyes. The feeling that the temperature in the room had just dropped by several degrees, though no one had turned on the air conditioning. Emmerich Langston crossed the threshold, and the darkness seemed to enter with him. He wore a black three-piece suit, no tie, the collar of his shirt open by one button, the scar along his left jawbone, clear beneath the crystal chandelier light. He didn't look at anyone. He didn't need to. The whole room had already looked at him. Beside him, tiny, her left hand holding her father's hand, her right arm clutching shadow to her chest, Bree followed in a white dress, her little white leather shoes tapping against the black marble floor. Emmerich had come for diplomatic ceremony. Two families, even as enemies, still had to maintain a surface of civility in front of officials and legitimate partners. He had come to be seen, to count faces, to read the room. He hadn't come because of Felicity. He didn't even know Felicity was here, but Bree knew. The little girl's gray eyes swept across the room in the way children look, without filters, without categories, only searching. And she found her. In the corner of the room, near the balcony door, a woman stood motionless, with a silver tray in her hands, her black and white server's uniform stained with one large red streak from chest to stomach, her eyes red but without tears, her back straight as though that was the only thing she still had left to hold on to. Felicity. Bree let go of her father's hand. Emmerich looked down, saw the small hand slip out of his, and before he could react, the little girl had already begun walking. Bree walked through the crowd. She didn't run. She walked, small step by small step, steady, her white shoes tapping evenly against the stone floor. Shadow held tightly in her arms. The people standing in her path automatically moved aside, not because they knew who the little girl was, but because there was something in the way she walked, in the way her eyes looked straight ahead without the slightest hesitation, that made grown people instinctively give way. The grand hall slowly fell quiet. The music was still playing, but the conversations went out in clusters like lamps being turned off one by one, because everyone was watching a 5-year-old child in a white dress holding a black cat as she walked through the most elite party in Boston with the determination of someone going to the place she knew, with absolute certainty, she had to reach. Bree stopped in front of Felicity. She looked up. Felicity looked down. The two of them had met 2 days earlier on a stone bench in Boston Common, and during those 2 days, Felicity hadn't thought she would ever see the gray-eyed child again. But the child was here, and the child was looking at her with unblinking eyes, and Shadow was giving a soft meow, recognizing the person who had saved him. Then Bree turned around, looked straight toward her father standing 15 steps away, and said in a clear voice that carried through the utterly silent grand hall, "Daddy, this is my new mommy. I already told you." Every word clear, every word coherent. In front of more than 100 people, a glass fell and shattered on the stone floor. Byron Ashford, 62 years old, seated at the head table at the front of the room, was trembling so hard he couldn't keep hold of his wine glass. He looked at the child, then at Felicity, and his face went gray because he recognized her at once. He recognized those warm brown eyes, recognized that slightly pointed chin, recognized everything he had pretended didn't exist for 27 years. Now standing in the middle of his party in a server's uniform with red wine staining her chest. Petra stood 5 steps away, her champagne glass frozen halfway in her hand, her face gone pale. Not because of what Bree had said, but because she was looking at Emmerich, and Emmerich was looking back at her. Emmerich didn't need more than 3 seconds. He read the room the way people who lived by instinct read a room. Faster than thought, deeper than words. He saw the red wine on Felicity's uniform. He saw her reddened eyes. He saw Petra standing closest. He saw the empty glass on Felicity's tray, and he understood. He walked over slowly, every step sounding against the stone floor like the strike of a hammer. He stopped before Felicity and, without saying a word, took off his suit jacket. The tailored jacket, worth 3 months' rent for an apartment in Dorchester, was placed over Felicity's shoulders by his hands, gently but decisively. That gesture, in this room, before these people, wasn't courtesy. Everyone in the underworld understood. When Emmerich Langston put his jacket on someone's shoulders, it meant that person belonged within his territory, and anyone who touched that person had touched him. Then Emmerich turned to Petra. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "I hope this isn't how the Ashford family treats its own blood. Because if it is, I'm beginning to understand why you're falling apart." Petra didn't answer. No one answered. Emmerich placed a hand on Felicity's back, light but firm, and said just loud enough for her to hear, "Let's go." Felicity followed him without understanding why her legs were still able to move. Bree took her hand on the other side, Shadow lying still in the little girl's arms. The 3 of them walked out of the grand hall, through the main doors, down the stone steps, and into the black SUV waiting with its engine running. The car door closed. The outside world disappeared. Inside the car, Bree sat between Felicity and Emmerich. She placed Shadow on Felicity's lap, then rested her head beside the cat, her eyes slowly closing. No words, no nightmares. Bree fell asleep within 30 seconds, so peacefully that Mrs. Pemberton, sitting in the front seat, had to turn around twice to make sure she wasn't seeing it wrong. This was the first time in 2 years Bree had slept without jerking awake, without crying, without calling for her mother. Emmerich looked over. He looked at his daughter with her head resting on the lap of a woman with the Ashford name, a woman in a red wine-stained server's uniform with tangled hair and a knee that still bore the scrape from 2 days ago, and he tightened the hand on his knee into a fist. Not because he was angry. Emmerich Langston had been angry many times in his life, and he knew what anger looked like. This wasn't anger. This was fear. Fear because for the first time in 2 years, he needed someone he couldn't control, couldn't buy, couldn't threaten. And Emmerich Langston never allowed himself to need anyone. That night, After the car stopped beneath Longfellow Bridge and Felicity stepped out with Emmerich's suit jacket still over her shoulders, she stood watching the black SUV disappear into the dark before she realized she was trembling. She took off the jacket, intending to fold it so she could return it someday, but its scent made her hands stop, sandalwood, and something sharp and cold she couldn't name. She folded it, placed it under the cardboard sheet as a pillow, and lay down. The 3 stray cats crept closer, the way they did every night. She couldn't sleep. The next morning, just as the morning sun touched the Charles River, another black SUV stopped 20 steps from the bridge. It wasn't Emmerich who stepped out. It was Finn. The 40-year-old man with a face that looked as though it had been carved from granite stood before Felicity, looking at her sitting on cardboard among 3 stray cats and the neatly folded suit jacket, and spoke in a polite voice that left no room for the word no. "Mr. Langston wants to see you." Felicity looked at Finn, looked at the SUV, then looked back at the 3 cats, eating the last piece of bread she had just broken for them. She stood, took the jacket with her, and got into the car without asking why, because people who slept under bridges didn't have the privilege of asking questions of people with power. The drive from Longfellow Bridge to Langston Tower in Back Bay took 15 minutes, and during those 15 minutes, Felicity watched Boston slide past the window as though she were watching a movie about someone else's life. The car stopped. Private elevator. Top floor. The doors opened, and Felicity stepped into a world she had never known existed, even though it was only a 15-minute drive from her bridge. The gray marble floor was so polished she could see her own reflection beneath her. Torn shoes, faded jeans, and a folded suit jacket in her hands. Original paintings hung on the walls, the kind whose artists Felicity didn't know, but instinctively understood each piece was worth more than everything her mother had earned in her whole life. The silence was heavy, the kind of silence only money could buy, the silence of thick walls, soundproof glass, and distance from the rest of the world. Emmerich sat behind his desk and didn't stand. He didn't invite her to sit. He only indicated the chair opposite him with a look, and Felicity understood that was the closest thing to an invitation she was going to get from this man. She sat down, her back straight, the suit jacket resting on her lap. Emmerich placed a file on the desk and pushed it toward her. The file was thick, black-covered, unlabeled. Felicity opened it. The first page was a copy of her birth certificate. The father field said unknown. The second page was a hospital record from Boston Medical Center, noting Lorraine, female, 51 years old, stage 4 lung cancer, pronounced dead at 2:47 in the morning. The only family member present was Felicity Ashford, daughter. The third page was a photograph of her sleeping beneath Longfellow Bridge, taken from a distance with a long lens, so clear she could see the tear on the shoulder of her coat, and the gray cat missing half an ear curled beside her feet. Felicity looked at the photograph, then looked at Emmerich. He had put someone on her. 48 hours was enough for Emmerich Langston to know everything he needed to know about a human being. Emmerich spoke, his voice as flat as the stone desk in front of him. "You're Byron Ashford's illegitimate daughter. Your mother was Lorraine. He never acknowledged you. You grew up in Dorchester. Your mother died 2 years ago. You went to the Ashford family, stayed 6 months, were framed for theft by Petra, and thrown onto the street. You currently have no home, no money, and no one." Every sentence was a truth, and every truth was a blade Felicity had to sit through without collapsing. She clenched her teeth. "If you called me here to read my own life story back to me, then don't bother. I lived through all of it. I don't need anyone to tell it to me." Emmerich didn't react to her tone. He continued speaking as though she hadn't opened her mouth. "Bree hasn't spoken normally since her mother died. 2 years. I hired every kind of doctor, every kind of specialist, paid any price. No one helped. Then you appeared on a bench in Boston Common with a bleeding knee and a cat in your arms, and my daughter spoke her first sentence in 2 years. Then you appeared at last night's party in a wine-stained server's uniform, and my daughter called you her mother in front of more than 100 people." He paused. "I need you in the mansion, with Bree, every day. A higher salary than any nanny on the East Coast, a private room, clothes, 3 meals, health insurance." Felicity looked at him, searching for the trap. She had learned to search for the trap in every kind offer since the day Petra had smiled and welcomed her into the house. Why not hire a child psychologist to live with Bree? Because a specialist doesn't have her mother's smile. The answer dropped onto the desk, heavier than the file. Felicity understood at once. She hadn't been chosen because she was good at anything, because she had any qualifications, because of who she was. She had been chosen because of a cruel coincidence of nature, because the corner of her mouth when she smiled looked like a dead woman's, and the child drowning in a dark sea had clung to that smile as if it were a life preserver. She wasn't the life preserver. She was the shape of one. Felicity stood. She placed the suit jacket on the desk, her face expressionless. Before she could say anything, Emmerich spoke again, his voice dropping a tone, and for the first time in the conversation, she heard something in his voice that wasn't an order, almost a warning. You carry the Ashford name. In my house, that is the name of the enemy. I'm letting you into my home because my daughter needs you, but betray me once, just once, and I won't go easy on you because you're a woman. Is that clear? Felicity looked straight into his steel gray eyes, the eyes the entire East Coast underworld didn't dare hold for more than 3 seconds, and she didn't look away. I have nothing to betray, Mr. Langston. People only betray when they have something to lose. Emmerich looked at her. A long silence settled between them, heavy and filled with everything neither of them said. Then he nodded, once, brief and sharp, the way he approved a contract. Finn will take you to collect your things. Felicity almost laughed. What things? She had no things. Everything she owned in this world was a broken flip phone, a torn coat, and 3 stray cats she didn't dare call hers. She walked out of the penthouse, and when the elevator doors closed, she leaned her back against the cold steel wall and shut her eyes. She had just agreed to step into the house of the most dangerous man on the East Coast of America, the man who had just told her to her face that he wouldn't be gentle if she made one wrong move. And she had agreed, not because of the money, not because of the private room or the 3 meals. She had agreed because she remembered Bree's gray eyes looking at her on the bench that afternoon, and she knew what that look meant. It was the look of a child drowning where no one could hear her cry. And Felicity Ashford, who had lost everything but still broke her last piece of bread for stray cats every morning, didn't know how to look at that kind of gaze and turn away. The Langston mansion stood on a quiet street in Beacon Hill. From the outside, it looked like an old 4-story red brick mansion built in the 19th century, with arched windows and wrought iron balconies covered in ivy, the kind of house tourists would photograph as they passed, and imagine that some old wealthy family must live inside with dogs and ancestral portraits. They would never guess that behind that antique brick exterior was a 360-degree surveillance camera system, bulletproof steel doors hidden behind wooden panels, a safe room buried beneath the basement, and an escape tunnel leading to the riverside behind the house that only Emmerich and Finn knew about. Felicity stepped through the main door on the morning of her first day, with a plastic bag holding a few sets of clothes. Finn had stopped to buy for her on the way there, and she stood in the grand hall, looking up at the ceiling 4 meters high, not knowing where she was supposed to put her foot next. Her room was on the 2nd floor, larger than the entire apartment her mother had rented in Dorchester. White bed, white curtains, polished oak floor, a private bathroom with a marble bathtub. She set the plastic bag on the floor and sat on the edge of the bed, both hands resting on her lap, feeling as though she were sitting in a hotel room someone had booked under her name by mistake. Mrs. Pemberton came to see her within the first hour. She explained the rules in the calm but precise voice of someone who had said these words many times to many people, and knew that every word mattered. The 4th floor was Mr. Langston's work area, and no one was allowed up there unless summoned. Never ask about Mr. Langston's work, about the people who came to see him, about the calls he took, or about the trips he made. Do not contact anyone outside the mansion without permission. If anyone asked what she did here, she was the nanny. That was all, nothing more. Felicity nodded at each rule. She didn't ask why. She had lived long enough in a world where questions of why didn't bring answers to know when to stay silent and watch. Bree came looking for her before she had even opened the plastic bag. The little girl appeared in the doorway, shadow in her arms, her gray eyes looking at Felicity with the same gaze Felicity had seen at Boston Common and at the party, a gaze she was beginning to grow used to but still couldn't stop finding astonishing. Bree didn't say hello. She took Felicity's hand and pulled her along. Down the stairs, through the hallway, out the back door, and into the garden behind the mansion. The garden was small, surrounded by high brick walls covered in vines, with several beds of yellow chrysanthemums wilting in the fall air, and a large red maple tree in the corner. Bree stopped in front of one flower bed, dropped into a crouch, and pointed at a chrysanthemum with its head bowed low. "This flower is sad because no one tells its stories." Felicity looked at the flower. Then she looked at Bree. Then she sat down beside the little girl on the damp earth, not caring that her new pants were getting muddy, and began telling the flower a made-up story about a caterpillar that was afraid of heights but still had to grow wings. Bree listened, tilted her head, then asked whether the caterpillar was afraid of clouds. Felicity said it probably was, but clouds were very soft, so falling into them wouldn't hurt. Bree nodded seriously. Then the corner of her mouth lifted. Only a little, like a flower petal just beginning to open, but Mrs. Pemberton was standing by the back door, looking out, and she had to turn back into the kitchen so no one would see her wiping her tears with the edge of her apron. 30 years in the Langston family, and she didn't cry. But seeing the child she had held since birth begin to smile again was more than she could hold back. From that day on, Shadow followed Felicity everywhere. The black Bombay cat lay under her feet when she ate breakfast, followed her when she walked in the garden with Bree, and every night leaped onto her bed, curled up on the pillow beside her head, and slept there. He had never done that with anyone except Bree. The first days passed in a strange rhythm. Felicity wasn't used to. Mornings with Bree in the garden, noons with Bree in the playroom, telling stories to Shadow and the stuffed animals Bree arranged in rows like students sitting through a lesson. Afternoons with Bree on the sofa, drawing with crayons, Bree drawing purple clouds and a sun with legs, Felicity drawing black cats and showing Bree how to draw whiskers. At night, Felicity read books to Bree before she slept, and this was when the little girl was quietest, lying still under the blanket. Shadow curled at her feet, eyes closed, breathing evenly. But at night, when Bree was asleep and the mansion sank into darkness, Felicity began to notice things that weren't normal. Heavy footsteps in the first-floor hallway at midnight, the sound of men in suits speaking in low voices before disappearing through the back door, a phone ringing at 2 or 3 in the morning, and Emmerich answering in a cold, clipped voice from the direction of the 4th floor. There were days when Emmerich vanished completely, not appearing at breakfast, lunch, or dinner, as if he had been swallowed into the walls of his own house, then returned late some evening with eyes red from lack of sleep, the collar of his shirt rumpled, and a look in his eyes. Felicity couldn't read, but that made her instinctively want to step back. She didn't ask. She remembered the rules, but she watched, because that was the only thing a year of living on the streets had taught her to do better than any other skill. 2 weeks passed inside the Langston mansion, and Felicity began to grow used to the strange rhythm of life in that place, used to the sound of footsteps at midnight, used to the days when she didn't see Emmerich, used to living in a house larger than anywhere she had ever stayed, and still feeling as though she were walking on a wire. But she couldn't get used to the dream. Every few nights, her mother came back, not in beautiful memories, but in images her subconscious wouldn't allow her to forget. Her mother was lying on the floral sofa in Dorchester, coughing into blood-stained tissues, so thin her shoulder bones jutted through her thin nightgown, and she turned to look at Felicity with eyes that already knew she was going to die, opening her mouth to say something Felicity never managed to hear, because she always woke up at that exact moment. On her 14th night in the mansion, Felicity woke at 2 o'clock in the morning with sweat damp on the back of her neck and her mother's voice still echoing in her head. Shadow was sleeping curled on the pillow, but she didn't want to lie back down. She went downstairs to the kitchen, intending to make tea, because that was the only thing her mother had taught her to do when she couldn't sleep, and also the only thing in this place that didn't cost money. The Langston Mansion's kitchen was as large as the living room in the Dorchester apartment, with stone counters, oak cabinets, a large island in the center, and darkness. Felicity didn't turn on the light because she had learned to find her way in the dark after a year of sleeping beneath a bridge. She opened a cabinet to look for a cup, and that was when she realized she wasn't alone. Emmerich was sitting at the corner of the kitchen island, on a high stool, in complete darkness. Moonlight slipped through the kitchen window, just enough for her to see the outline of his face, his tie removed, the top 2 buttons of his shirt undone, his collar rumpled. In front of him on the stone surface were an empty whiskey glass and a small photograph. Felicity stopped, her hand still on the cabinet door. The two of them looked at each other in the dark, and for those few seconds, no one was the boss. No one was the hired help. No one was Langston. No one was Ashford. They were only two people who couldn't sleep at 2 o'clock in the morning, in a kitchen too large for their loneliness. Felicity looked down at the photograph on the counter. A young woman with dark blonde hair was holding a newborn baby in the hospital, smiling brightly. The baby was wrapped in a white blanket. Only a tiny, wrinkled face and one little hand clutching the mother's finger showing Cordelia and Bree. Felicity didn't know whether she should pretend she hadn't seen it or say something, but she wasn't good at pretending, and she was too tired to try. She was very beautiful. Emmerich's voice answered after a long beat of silence, low and dry, carrying no emotion Felicity could name. "She's dead." 2 words. Then the silence returned, heavier than before, filling the kitchen from floor to ceiling. Felicity said nothing more. She poured hot water into a cup, dropped in a tea bag, and leaned back against the kitchen cabinet, 4 steps away from Emmerich, drinking tea in the dark and letting the silence exist without trying to break it. Then Emmerich spoke, more quietly, as if the question had escaped him against his will. "Is Bree asleep?" "Yes. No nightmares. The 12th night in a row." Emmerich didn't look at her when he heard that answer, but Felicity saw his jaw tighten, saw his fingers close around the empty whiskey glass and then release it. And she understood that 12 straight nights without nightmares, to this man, meant more than any $1 million deal he had ever signed. Silence held for a while longer. Then Emmerich asked, his voice still low, but with something different in it, as though he truly wanted to know the answer and wasn't interrogating her. "Are you afraid of me?" Felicity didn't hesitate. "Yes." Emmerich looked at her. She looked back. "But I'm more afraid of hunger, and I'm more afraid of watching Bree hurt." Emmerich didn't answer. He rose from the stool, picked up the photograph of Cordelia, slipped it into his shirt pocket, and walked past Felicity to leave the kitchen. He stopped when his shoulder was almost touching hers, close enough for her to smell whiskey, sandalwood, and something underneath she couldn't name, something that made the rhythm of her heartbeat change. "Never open the 4th floor room." His voice was low, close, every word clear. "You won't like what you see in there." Then he walked away. The sound of his footsteps on the wooden floor faded, went up the stairs, and disappeared. Felicity stood alone in the dark kitchen, the hot tea in her hand gone cold without her noticing, and her heart was beating faster than normal. She wondered what she was afraid of. Then she realized, with a strange feeling like missing a step on the stairs, that the thing making her heart race wasn't fear. A month passed, and the small world between Felicity and Bree slowly grew larger in the garden behind the mansion, like a plant that had taken root without anyone planting it. Every flower in the garden now had a name. The bowed yellow chrysanthemum Bree had pointed to on the first day was named Mrs. Mabel, because Bree said it looked like an old lady who kept nodding off. The lavender bushes along the wall were called the Purple Family, because they grew in clusters, and Bree said they were hugging one another. The red maple tree in the corner was named Mr. Tall, because the little girl couldn't think of any other name for something that tall. Every night before bedtime, Felicity told stories to Shadow, though really she was telling them to Bree, because the little girl lay beneath the blanket holding the black cat and listened with her wide open eyes instead of her ears. And the made-up stories about flying cats, singing clouds, and ladybugs afraid of rain slowly helped her begin to answer in sentences that grew longer, clearer, and more logical, even though they still carried the private colors of the inner world Bree had built through 2 silent years. Dr. Whitfield came for a routine visit at the end of the month, and when he sat in the first-floor parlor listening to Mrs. Pemberton describe Bree's changes, he couldn't hide his astonishment. He told Emmerich over the phone that this was the most significant progress he had seen in Bree since she began therapy, and that he didn't fully understand what mechanism was at work, but whatever was happening, they shouldn't change it. Emmerich said nothing over the phone, but that night, when he passed Bree's room at 9 o'clock, he stopped outside the slightly open door and heard Felicity telling Bree about Milo. Her voice was soft, slow, carrying a sadness she wasn't trying to hide because she didn't know anyone was listening. Fell's mother once had a little black cat a lot like Shadow, and his name was Milo. Milo liked sleeping on Fell's mother's pillow, and he loved knocking Fell's mother's socks under the bed. Bree asked where Milo was. Felicity was quiet for a while, then said Milo had gotten lost, and though Fell had searched everywhere, Her little friend hadn't found his way back home to her yet. Bree held Shadow tighter and said Shadow wouldn't get lost because Shadow knew the way home. Emmerich stood outside the door, his back against the hallway wall, his eyes closed, and listened. The next day, Bree told her father about Milo at breakfast, describing in the most excited voice she could manage that Milo had black ears and golden eyes like Shadow, only smaller, and that he liked chasing socks, and that Mother Fell was sad because Milo had gotten lost. Emmerich listened without comment, but when Bree ran off to play with Felicity, he called Finn into his study and said something Felicity didn't know. Then came one night. On the 32nd night after Felicity moved in, Bree startled awake at midnight, and Felicity ran to the little girl's room the moment she heard crying through the thin wall between their rooms. Bree was sitting on the bed, her eyes open but not seeing Felicity, not seeing the room, not seeing Shadow meowing anxiously beside her. She was looking at something only she could see, something replaying behind her gray eyes like a film jammed in place. Her voice slipped out, distant, not the voice of a 5-year-old child, but the voice of someone reciting something that had happened too many times in sleep, until dream and memory could no longer be separated. There was a red car, green lights underneath. Mommy was crying. The window was open. Felicity pulled Bree into her arms, stroked the little girl's hair, and Bree clung to her as though clinging to her mother, both small hands gripping Felicity's nightgown while her body shook in waves. Shadow jumped onto the bed, pressed himself against Bree's back, and purred in a steady rhythm. Little by little, Bree stopped trembling, stopped crying, and fell asleep again in Felicity's arms. But Felicity didn't sleep. She lay there in the dark, holding Bree, and repeated the 4 fragments of memory the little girl had just let fall like 4 puzzle pieces without a picture. Red car, green lights underneath. Mommy was crying, window open. She didn't understand what they meant. She didn't know those were the only fragments of memory a 3-year-old child had kept from the night her mother died. Fragments too small to become a story, but sharp enough to cut into her sleep every night for 2 years. She only knew that those 4 pieces mattered. So she remembered them, placed them in a corner of her mind, and waited. News that Felicity was living inside the Langston mansion reached Petra's ears faster than Felicity had imagined, because in this world, no wall was thick enough to keep secrets, and no family existed without someone willing to sell information for the right price. Petra knew within 2 weeks, and Petra acted within 2 days after that. The diplomatic meeting between the 2 families took place in a private restaurant on a high floor of the Four Seasons Hotel, the kind of room where the menu had no prices and the windows looked out over all of Boston Harbor. Emmerich sat on one side of the table, with Finn standing behind him. Petra sat on the other side, with 2 Ashford men standing behind her. Byron didn't come. His health wouldn't allow it, or perhaps he simply didn't want to sit in the same room with the man he suspected was trying to bury his family. Petra began with diplomacy, talking about territory, shipping routes, and operational boundaries. But as soon as the main course was served, she leaned forward, lowered her voice, and dropped the bomb she had prepared. Mr. Langston, I hear you have a special guest in your home. I hope you know that girl is my father's bastard child. Her mother was a whore in Dorchester. My father never acknowledged her because there was nothing to acknowledge. She's a thief. I threw her out of the house because she stole family jewelry. And now you're letting her live with your daughter. Petra said those words in a voice of concern, as though she were worried for Bree, but her eyes were cold and calculating, and Emmerich could read everything behind that layer of makeup because he had been reading people far better than Petra for 20 years. Emmerich cut the meat on his plate, slowly, without looking up, and answered in the voice Finn knew was his boss's most dangerous one because it carried no emotion at all. I knew who she was before you did, Petra. I know who her mother was, who her father was, where she's been for the past 27 years, what she eats, where she sleeps, and how many times she has broken bread for stray cats instead of eating breakfast. I also know she didn't steal the jewelry, and I know you know that. Petra said nothing more for the rest of the meal. But 6 days later, when Felicity went out to buy crayons for Bree at the store on Charles Street, a man she had never seen before blocked her path on the sidewalk. He wasn't large. He didn't look frightening on the outside. He wore an ordinary jacket, his baseball cap pulled low, but the way he stood directly in her way showed this wasn't an accident. He spoke quickly, his voice low, not looking straight at her face. Leave the Langston mansion. You don't belong there. Stay, and you'll die like your mother, alone and poor. Or worse." Then he walked away, blending into the flow of people on the sidewalk, disappearing as though he had never been there. Felicity stood in the street, holding the bag of crayons, and trembled. She trembled from her fingertips to her heels, the kind of trembling she hadn't felt since the first night she slept beneath Longfellow Bridge and woke at 3 o'clock in the morning because the sound of strange footsteps had come too close. But she didn't run. She thought of Bree. She thought of the gray eyes looking at her every morning when the little girl ran into her room holding Shadow and asked whether Mrs. Mabel was happy today. She thought of 12 straight nights without nightmares, then 20 nights, then 30 nights. She gripped the bag of crayons tightly and kept walking back toward the mansion. That night, Felicity didn't go down to the kitchen. She went out to the back garden, sat beneath the maple tree Bree called Mr. Tall, held Shadow in her arms, and cried. She cried without sound, the kind of crying a year of living on the streets had taught her, the kind of crying no one heard, no one saw, no one knew about. She cried because of the threat. She cried because of Milo. She cried because of her mother. She cried because she was 27 years old, sitting in the garden of a stranger's house, holding a stranger's cat, and there wasn't a single place in the world that was truly hers. She didn't know that on the 4th floor, inside the study she wasn't allowed to enter, Emmerich was sitting before the security camera screens and watching her. He saw her sitting beneath the tree. He saw her holding Shadow. He saw her shoulders shaking. He didn't step outside. He didn't call anyone. He sat there, in the dark, and watched like a man guarding something he didn't know how to touch without breaking it. The next morning, when Felicity woke, there was a small cardboard box with holes punched in it on her bedside table. Inside, curled on a soft piece of fabric, was a kitten, black ears, round golden eyes, short, smooth fur, not completely black but with a honey-colored tint under its belly, just like Milo. Not Milo, but so similar that Felicity had to sit down on the edge of the bed because her legs couldn't hold her. Beside the box was a small folded note, and on it was handwriting she recognized at once, though she had never seen it before, because the handwriting was as sharp, cold, and precise as the person who had written it. "The name is yours to choose." Felicity lifted the kitten, and it was weightless, fitting perfectly in her 2 palms. It gave a weak meow, opened its golden eyes, and looked at her, and she remembered Milo looking at her exactly like that the first time her mother brought him home in a shoebox. She named it Clover, because Clover was the only thing that could grow between the bricks beneath Longfellow Bridge, and she had once thought that if something that small could survive in a place that terrible, then maybe she could survive too. Felicity held Clover to her chest, pressed her face into the tiny soft fur, and cried. But this time, she cried for a completely different reason. She cried because, for the first time in 27 years, someone had seen her crying in the dark, and instead of walking away, that person had quietly found a way to wipe away her tears without needing her to know. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, when Felicity was looking for Bree because the little girl had run off somewhere with Shadow after lunch without saying a word. Felicity went up to the 3rd floor, where Bree's playroom and reading room were, walked down the hallway, and when she passed the small meeting room near the stairs leading to the 4th floor, she heard Emmerich's voice. The door was half closed, not fully shut, and his voice carried out clearly because he was speaking faster than usual, low, but threaded with a tension Felicity had never heard from the man who always controlled every syllable that left his mouth. Felicity knew she should walk away. Rule number 1, don't ask about his work, don't listen, don't know. But her feet stopped because she heard a name. Cordelia. Emmerich was speaking to Finn, fast and clipped, each sentence like a bullet. Evidence from the traffic cameras on the night Cordelia died. The footage had been erased, but the technical team had recovered part of it. The restored footage was still heavily distorted by electromagnetic interference from that night, leaving the cars little more than a dark shadow and the license plate a blurred sequence that experts couldn't verify as a solid lead. Finn said they had checked, and that car didn't belong to Byron's official fleet, wasn't listed among declared assets, but belonged to a shell company registered in Delaware under the name of a proxy. Emmerich said, his voice colder than steel. The one who gave the order wasn't Byron, it was someone beneath him. Someone with a private fleet, enough power to erase camera data within 24 hours, and enough reason to want Cordelia dead. Felicity stood outside the door, her back against the wall, and felt as though the blood inside her had begun to flow backward. Red car. Green lights underneath. Bree's 4 fragments of memory repeated inside her head like a bell she had been hearing without understanding for weeks, now suddenly ringing so clearly it was almost blinding. Petra had a private fleet. Felicity had seen it while she was still living at the Ashford compound, lined up in the private garage behind the mansion, all of them wine red cars, and beneath each one was a strip of green LED lights, something Petra proudly called her signature, something everyone in their world knew was the identifying mark of Petra Ashford's cars. Red car, green lights, underneath. Then another memory crashed over her, so forcefully Felicity had to reach out and grip the wall to steady herself. One late night at the Ashford compound, around the 4th month of the 6 months she had lived there, she had woken up to get water and passed Petra's study. The door was open, the desk lamp on, and Petra was talking on the phone, her chair turned with her back to the door, unaware someone was passing by. Felicity hadn't stopped for long, only a few seconds, but she had heard Petra speak and then laugh, that small, sharp laugh she would never forget. That accident on Cornwall Street? It's done. Don't worry, no one can trace it. Cornwall Street. Felicity hadn't known then what Cornwall Street meant. But now, standing outside the 3rd-floor meeting room in the Langston mansion, she knew. She knew because 3 weeks earlier, when Mrs. Pemberton had told her about Cordelia in the kitchen one morning while Bree was still asleep, the woman had said Cordelia had died on Cornwall Street, Charlestown, on the night of October 17th, 2 years ago. Cornwall Street, red car, green lights underneath. Mommy was crying, window open. Bree had been 3 years old that night. Bree had looked through the window and seen the red car with green lights underneath. Bree had heard her mother crying. And Bree had carried that fragment of memory into her sleep for 2 years, repeating it night after night, with no one understanding because no one knew what needed to be understood. Petra killed Cordelia. The conclusion formed in Felicity's mind, not slowly, but like lightning striking, clear, sharp, undeniable. Petra had the red cars with green lights. Petra had mentioned Cornwall Street and laughed. Cordelia had died on Cornwall Street. Bree had seen the red car with green lights on the night her mother died. Felicity released the wall, stepped back, turned, and went down to the 2nd floor. She found Bree in the playroom, drawing, with Shadow lying beside her and Clover asleep in the little girl's lap. Felicity sat down beside Bree, watched her draw a sun with legs, and felt the weight of what she had just discovered press against her chest like a stone. She knew who had killed Bree's mother, and she knew that if she told Emmerich, she would be betraying the family that carried her name, the family led by her biological father, the bloodline she carried, the name on her birth certificate. But she also knew that if she stayed silent, she would be betraying the child sitting beside her, drawing a son with legs, the child who called her Mother Fell, the child who had lost her mother to a murderer Felicity could name. She looked at Bree. Bree looked up, smiled, and handed her the drawing. Mother Fell. I drew this for Mother Fell. In the picture, there were 3 people. One tall person dressed in black, one person with long hair, and one tiny person in the middle, holding both their hands. Underneath them were 3 cats. Felicity held the drawing, and she knew what she was going to do. Felicity waited until Bree was asleep. She read the little girl the story about the caterpillar afraid of heights, stroked her hair until her breathing grew even, and Shadow curled at the foot of the bed. Then she tucked the blanket around Bree, placed Clover beside the pillow, and stepped out into the hallway. She stood at the foot of the stairs leading to the 4th floor for a very long time. Long enough for the clock on the wall to strike 12. Long enough for her to think again and again about everything she was about to do, and everything that could happen after she did it. She was preparing to break the only rule Emmerich Langston had set for her, the rule he had said to her face in a voice that left no room for doubt, in the dark kitchen at 2 o'clock in the morning, standing close enough that she could smell sandalwood on his collar. Never open the 4th floor room. You won't like what you see in there. Felicity stepped onto the 1st stair, then the 2nd. Each stair creaked beneath her feet in the silence of the midnight mansion, and every creak sounded like one final warning. She reached the 4th floor. The hallway was dark, with only a thin strip of light slipping out from beneath the door at the end. He was still awake. She walked to the door and knocked, not timidly. She knocked 3 times, clear and even, because she knew that if she hesitated at this step, she would never take the next one. Footsteps sounded inside. A lock turned. The door opened. Emmerich stood in the doorway, his white shirt sleeves rolled to his elbows, no tie, his hair slightly disordered as though he had run his hand through it many times, and his gray eyes looked at her with surprise that lasted exactly 1 second before freezing cold. "What did I tell you about this room?" It wasn't a question. It was a reminder, a warning. The last chance for her to turn around, go back down the stairs, return to her room, pretend nothing had happened, and keep living inside the safe little bubble he had built for her and Bree. Felicity looked straight into his eyes and said, "I know who killed Cordelia." Silence. Not ordinary silence. The kind of silence Felicity could feel on her skin, as though all the air in the hallway had just been sucked away and she was standing in a vacuum. Emmerich didn't blink, didn't move. For one moment, he stood so still he no longer looked like a living man, but like a statue carved from stone and rage and 2 years of waiting. Then he stepped aside, opened the door wider, and Felicity entered the 4th floor for the first time. Emmerich's study wasn't what she had imagined. There were no weapons hanging on the walls, no obvious safe, nothing that looked like the Mafia movies she had seen before. Only a large oak desk, 2 computer screens, stacks of files, a map of Boston Harbor pinned to the wall, and the smell of old tobacco, as if someone had smoked there a very long time ago and never smoked again. But the scent was still there, soaked into the wood, soaked into the curtains, like a ghost refusing to leave. Emmerich closed the door. The lock clicked into place with a dry sound in the room. He didn't sit. He leaned against the edge of the desk, both hands gripping the wood, and looked at her with eyes in which she could read nothing but absolute waiting. "Talk." Felicity talked. She told him about the night Bree had woken up crying, about the 4 fragments of memory the little girl had let slip in her nightmare. Red car, green lights underneath. Mommy was crying. Window open. She told him about Petra's private fleet, all wine-red cars with green LED lights under the chassis, a signature everyone in their world knew. She told him about the late night at the Ashford compound, when Petra had been on the phone, mentioned the accident on Cornwall Street, and laughed. Cornwall Street. The place where Cordelia had been killed. She told him everything, held nothing back, added nothing, made no excuses for the family whose name she carried. When she stopped, Emmerich was still standing at the edge of the desk, his posture unchanged, but his eyes had changed. They were no longer gray. They had gone dark, gone deep, as though his pupils had widened enough to swallow the irises whole and she was looking into 2 black holes from which nothing could escape. "You just betrayed your blood family." Emmerich's voice wasn't louder than a whisper, but every word carried a weight Felicity could feel pressing on her shoulders. She didn't step back. "They're not my family. Family doesn't turn its own blood into someone homeless. Family doesn't steal a sister's cat and then tell her to kneel if she wants him back. Bree is more my family than any Ashford ever was." Emmerich left the edge of the desk. He walked toward her, slowly, step by step, and stopped very close, closer than he had been in the kitchen that night, close enough that she had to look up to meet his eyes. He raised his hand, placed his finger beneath her chin, and lifted her face, forcing her to look straight at him. His fingers were hot, hard, rough with calluses, and they were trembling. Felicity felt it clearly. The fingers of Emmerich Langston, the man who had built an empire out of iron and blood, were trembling against her chin. "Do you know what I'll do if this information is wrong?" "Yes, and you still came, because Bree deserves to know the truth, because Cordelia deserves justice." Emmerich looked at her. She looked back at him. And in that moment, inside the 4th floor study she was never supposed to enter, with the door locked behind her, and the full weight of an underworld empire heavy on the shoulders of the man standing before her, something changed. Not loudly, not dramatically. Only the way Emmerich looked at her changed, from cold to something she had never seen in those eyes before. Something like the look of a man who had lived in darkness for so long and suddenly saw someone light a candle, and he didn't know whether to blow it out or shield it from the wind. Emmerich didn't step back. He lowered his head, slowly, his forehead so close to hers that she felt his breath against her skin, and he said, low and hoarse, each word as though it had been dragged from his chest by force, "You're the most dangerous person I've ever met, Felicity Ashford, because you make me want to believe. Emmerich acted within 72 hours after that night on the fourth floor, and he acted the way he did everything, fast, precise, and without leaving his opponent any room to breathe. On the first night, he called Finn into the study, and the two of them sat there until 4 o'clock in the morning, piecing together everything Felicity had provided with the 2 years of evidence Emmerich's private investigation team had collected. Bree's memory fragment about the red car and green lights matched perfectly with the restored traffic camera footage, in which the car leaving Cornwall Street at 11:47 on the night of October 17th had green LED lights flashing beneath its chassis, matching the identifying feature of Petra's private fleet. With Felicity's specific description of the signature green glow, the technical team applied high-spectrum color filters to the corrupted frames, finally confirming the unique LED patterns that led them to the specific ghost plate manufacturer used by the Ashfords. The license plate was fake, but it matched the plate supplier Petra's shell company had used in 3 other transactions. Call records from Petra's phone number that night showed 2 outgoing calls within 1 hour after Cordelia was killed, one to her private lawyer and one to the contact inside the traffic police department, after which the camera data had been erased. Recovered messages from Petra's old phone, obtained through an inside source in the Ashford family, whom Finn had spent 6 months planting, confirmed the order to carry out the hit. On the second night, Emmerich made a single phone call to a number he had never used before, the number of the federal agent in charge of organized crime in the New England region. He spoke for 9 minutes, providing enough evidence for the FBI to open a federal investigation into attempted murder, money laundering, and obstruction of justice. He didn't do this because he believed in the law. He did it because he wanted Petra handled cleanly, publicly, and in a way no Ashford could save her from. A bullet would be faster, but a federal sentence would last longer. On the third night, Emmerich sent a diplomatic meeting invitation to the Ashford family, outwardly for negotiations over the redistribution of shipping routes through the Port of Boston, a subject important enough that Petra couldn't refuse to attend without losing face. The meeting took place on the top floor of Langston Tower, in a glass conference room overlooking all of Boston Harbor. Emmerich sat at the head of the table, Finn stood behind him, and 3 lawyers from Langston Holdings sat to the left with their laptops already open. Petra arrived on time, confident, in a black gown, her hair pinned high, wearing the string of pearls Felicity recognized from the party, accompanied by 2 family advisors. And Byron Ashford, 62 years old, thinner than the last time Felicity had seen him, leaning on a cane, was helped into the chair at the opposite end of the table by 2 men. Emmerich had invited Byron by name. The old man couldn't refuse without admitting he had lost control of the family to his daughter. Felicity wasn't in the conference room. She was on the second floor with Bree, reading books, drawing pictures, pretending this was an ordinary day while, above her head, the world was about to explode. The meeting began with 15 minutes of negotiations over shipping routes, enough for Petra to relax, enough for Byron to sit still, enough for everyone in the room to think this was only a routine business meeting between 2 families. Then Emmerich nodded to Finn, and Finn turned on the large screen on the wall. The first image was the restored traffic camera footage, blurred but clear enough to show the wine-red car leaving Cornwall Street, green LED lights flashing beneath it in the dark. The second image was a comparison chart between the fake plate on the car and 3 other fake plates Petra's shell company had used, matching supplier, matching format, matching printing technique. The third image was the call chart from the night of October 17th, showing 2 outgoing calls from Petra's number within 1 hour after Cordelia died, one to a lawyer, one to an inside contact in the police department. The fourth image was a screenshot of the recovered messages. The conference room went so silent that Felicity probably could have heard it from the second floor if she had tried. Petra looked at the screen, and Felicity later heard from Finn that she went through 3 stages within 10 seconds, confidence turning into confusion, confusion turning into panic, like watching a film in fast forward. Petra shot to her feet, her chair falling backward, and pointed straight into empty space as though Felicity were standing there, even though she was 2 floors away. That girl betrayed the family, that bastard. You believe a homeless girl over the Ashford family, Langston? Byron sat motionless, both hands wrapped around the head of his cane, his face gray as ash, and he didn't look at Petra. He looked down at the table, at his own faint reflection on the glass surface, and said nothing. Petra kept shouting, her voice beginning to crack, the paint of confidence peeling off in strips. I did it for the family. Cordelia Langston discovered our illegal alliance with the Moreno family and the stolen shipping schedules. She had evidence. She was going to hand it to the federal authorities. If we didn't stop her, the entire Ashford family would collapse, all of it, including you, Father. I had no other choice. The truth finally fell from Petra's mouth, not because she wanted to confess, but because she was trying to justify herself, trying to pull Byron onto the same side, trying to turn herself from a murderer into the savior of the family. Cordelia Langston hadn't died because of an accident. She had died because she discovered Petra was selling the Langston cargo schedules to their rivals in Chicago, and she had enough evidence to bury the entire Ashford family. Petra ordered her stopped. Permanently. Emmerich sat and listened from beginning to end, without saying a single word. When Petra finished, he stood slowly, buttoned his suit jacket with one hand, and spoke in a voice so calm that Finn later admitted it chilled him more than any gunshot. Get out of my city before dawn. Petra opened her mouth to say more, but the conference room door opened. 2 men and 1 woman in gray suits, wearing FBI badges, stepped in. Federal agents, Organized Crime Division. Petra Ashford, you're under arrest on a federal warrant for first-degree attempted murder, money laundering, and obstruction of justice. Petra looked at Emmerich, looked at the FBI, looked back at Emmerich, then looked at Byron, her father, the man she had just screamed that she had killed to protect. Byron didn't look back. He sat there, his cane held before his chest, eyes closed, and 2 tears ran down both sides of his wrinkled cheeks, tears he didn't bother to wipe away. Petra was handcuffed and led out. She didn't scream again. She was silent, and according to Finn, that silence was more frightening than the screaming. After the FBI led Petra out of the conference room, Byron Ashford remained sitting alone at the head of the table for a long time, long enough for the Langston lawyers to pack up their laptops and leave, long enough for Finn to open the room's ventilation because the air inside was heavy with expensive perfume and collapse. Then he asked to see Felicity. Emmerich didn't stop him. He nodded to Finn, and Finn went down to the 2nd floor and told Felicity that Byron Ashford wanted to speak with her. Felicity was sitting on the playroom floor with Bree, the 2 of them working on a puzzle, Shadow lying on one piece, while Clover tried to eat another. She looked at Finn, then looked at Bree, then stood, told the little girl that Mother Fell would be gone for a little while and would come back, and Bree nodded without looking up because she was busy explaining to Shadow that the puzzle piece wasn't a pillow. Felicity entered the conference room on the top floor of Langston Tower for the first time. Byron sat there, his cane held before him, his back bent, his gray hair thin, and when he looked up at her, Felicity saw a 62-year-old man, and no crime boss at all. He was crying. Not loudly, not with sobs, only with tears running steadily down his wrinkled cheeks. And he didn't wipe them away, as though he no longer had enough strength or no longer cared enough to hide them. I was wrong to abandon you. His voice trembled, each word difficult, as if dragged from somewhere deep inside him that he had kept locked for 27 years. Your mother was the best woman I ever met. Lorraine was the only person who looked at me not because of money or power, but because of me, and I was too cowardly to keep her. I chose reputation. I chose the family. I chose Petra, and look where that choice brought me. Felicity stood 5 steps away from him. She didn't sit down. She didn't come closer. She looked at the man who had given her his blood but nothing else, the man who had sat in the next room and listened while Petra threw her onto the street without stepping out, the man who had known she existed for 27 years and chosen to pretend she wasn't real, and she felt many things at once: anger, sadness, pity, exhaustion, but she didn't feel the thing he was searching for in her eyes. She didn't feel forgiveness. You gave me a place in this world, but you didn't give me a place in your family. Her voice was calm, not cold, not hot, only truthful, and truth sometimes hurt more than a knife. My mother died in a miserable apartment in Dorchester, coughing up blood, without proper health insurance, without anyone except me. Where were you then? You were in Beacon Hill, drinking wine, while the woman you called the best woman you ever met died of lung cancer on a sofa bought from a thrift store. You don't need to apologize to me, Mr. Ashford, because I've already found where I belong. She turned her back, She walked out. She didn't look back. Behind her, Byron Ashford lowered his head onto the two hands gripping the head of his cane, and the sound of his crying drifted into the hallway. But Felicity had already gone far enough that she didn't have to hear it. The boss, who had once held the power of life and death over all of New England, had now collapsed inside his enemy's conference room, brought down not by guns or money or power, but by one sentence from the daughter he had abandoned before she had even known her father's face. That night, Felicity went up to the mansion roof. She had found the place during her second week there, a small skylight window on the fourth floor leading out to a flat stretch of roof in the back, wide enough to sit, high enough to see the sky above the rooftops of Beacon Hill. She often came up here every night after Bree was asleep, because this was something she had carried with her from the days when she was homeless, the habit of watching the stars, because the sky was the only free thing no one could take away. She was sitting with her knees hugged to her chest, looking up at the faint Milky Way above the city lights, when she heard footsteps on the roof. Emmerich sat down beside her. He didn't ask permission. He didn't say anything. He only sat, his shoulder a handspan away from hers, looking up at the same sky. There was no desk between them. No file, no contract, no rules, no families. Only the roof, the sky, and a handspan of distance that both of them felt was shorter than any distance they had ever shared. Silence lingered for a long time. Then Emmerich spoke, his voice low, slow, as though he was practicing a language he hadn't used in so long that he had forgotten how to pronounce it. That day at Boston Common, when I got the call from the bodyguard, I drove 15 minutes across the city, breaking every speed limit. I thought I was driving that fast because of Bree, but when I arrived, I saw you sitting on that stone bench, your knee bleeding, holding the cat, and smiling. You smiled when there was no reason to smile, Felicity. You had no home, no money, no one, your knee was bleeding, and you smiled at the cat as though the world still had something worth smiling for. He stopped. Cordelia used to smile like that. I thought when she died, that smile died with her. Then you appeared, and I knew I was in trouble. Felicity looked at him. Trouble? Because I didn't hire you only because of Bree. I hired you because I was afraid that if I let you go, I would never find again the thing I had lost. Emmerich didn't look at her as he said those words. He looked straight ahead, into the sky, at the stars she watched every night, and his hand lowered between them, palm turned upward, open, empty. The hand that had given orders, held guns, signed commands to erase enemies, built an entire empire from the seaport to Manhattan, now rested between them on the roof, turned upward, waiting. Felicity looked at that hand. Then she placed her own inside it. Her hand was small, thin, cold, resting in his large, warm, calloused palm. Emmerich closed his hand around it, gently. So gently it was almost impossible to believe from a man used to solving everything with force, as though he were holding something he knew would break if he wasn't careful. The two of them sat on the roof, hand in hand, looking at the Boston sky, and neither of them said anything more because there was nothing more that needed to be said. The next morning, Felicity was lying there, staring at the ceiling, not fully awake yet, her hand still warm from the memory of the night before on the roof, when her bedroom door burst open, and a little storm rushed in. Bree jumped onto the bed with Shadow held in her left arm, and Clover tucked under her right, the kitten meowing in protest because she was being held upside down. But Bree didn't notice. The little girl set both cats down on the blanket and rolled after them, lying close against Felicity, her gray eyes wide and bright in a way they never would have been 2 months earlier. Mother Fell, today the clouds taste like strawberries. I looked through the window already. The clouds are very pink. I want to have breakfast with Daddy and Mother Fell. Felicity lay still for a moment, not because she hadn't heard clearly, but because she needed one whole breath to feel the fullness of what had just happened. Bree had called her Mother Fell, not in front of a crowd to shock everyone, the way she had at the Ashford party. Not in the middle of overwhelming emotion like that first time at Boston Common. This time, Bree called her Mother Fell as though it were the most obvious thing in the world, as though the little girl had been calling her by that name since before they had even met, as though those 2 words didn't need an event, didn't need a stage, only an ordinary morning with pink clouds and 2 cats and a warm bed. And Bree wanted to have breakfast with her father. For the first time since Felicity had moved in, the little girl wanted, on her own, to sit and eat with both her father and Felicity, at the same time, at the same table, like something ordinary children in ordinary families did every morning without having to think about it. Felicity wrapped her arms around Bree, breathed in the scent of children's shampoo in her hair, and said that strawberry-flavored clouds sounded delicious, and they should have breakfast right away before the clouds changed flavors. Bree laughed, a small laugh but a real one, and the two of them, along with the two cats, pulled themselves out of the room and went down the hallway, down the stairs. Mrs. Pemberton was standing outside the kitchen door. She had heard Bree speak through the child monitoring system she always kept on through the night, and she had been standing there since the moment Bree ran out of her room. When Bree and Felicity passed by, Bree holding Felicity's hand on one side and Shadow in her other arm, with Clover trotting behind them, Mrs. Pemberton turned her face to the wall and cried. Without sound, she lifted her apron to cover her mouth and cried the way old people cry, shoulders shaking but no sound coming out, because she had waited 2 years to hear the child she had held since birth call someone mother as though it were normal, and at last, she had heard it. In the kitchen, Felicity began taking out plates, and Bree climbed onto the high chair at the small kitchen table, not the formal dining table in the enormous banquet room no one used, but the little wooden table in the kitchen where Mrs. Pemberton often sat for afternoon tea. Bree placed Shadow on her lap, Clover settled beneath the chair, and the little girl arranged 3 sets of silverware on the table, one for herself, one for Mother Fell, and one for Daddy, solemn as though she were carrying out the most important task of the day. Then Emmerich appeared in the kitchen doorway. Black suit, white shirt, straight tie, his face cold as usual, as if last night on the roof had never happened, as if his hand had never held hers beneath the starlit sky. But Felicity looked closer and saw the corners of his eyes shining, a light she had never seen there in all the weeks before. Bree looked up. Daddy, sit here. I put silverware out for you already. Emmerich looked at his daughter sitting at the small kitchen table, a black cat on her lap, a tiny cat beneath her feet, beside the woman he had brought home from beneath Longfellow Bridge, and he nodded. Breakfast, one word. But he sat down. He sat down in the small wooden chair in the kitchen, the most powerful man on the east coast of America sitting at a table barely big enough for 3 people, his knees almost touching the table, while Bree picked up a piece of pancake with her hand and held it out for Shadow to smell. The cat sniffed it, then turned his face away, and Bree said Shadow didn't like pancakes because pancakes didn't taste like clouds, and Felicity laughed. She laughed, not the quiet, aching smile she had carried with her from beneath Longfellow Bridge, but a real smile, wide, warm, her eyes narrowing with it. Emmerich watched her smile, and the corner of his mouth lifted, not much, only the faintest curve at the edge, only a slight easing of the muscles in his face, a change so small anyone who wasn't looking carefully would have missed it. But it was the first time in 2 years that Emmerich Langston had smiled, and Mrs. Pemberton, standing by the stove as she poured more pancake batter into the pan, had to turn away again because she couldn't cry and flip pancakes at the same time without burning them. 6 months later, on a spring afternoon, Felicity sat on the very stone bench in Boston Common where everything had begun. The same bench, the same park. But nothing was the same as that first time. The first time she sat here, she had been wearing a torn coat, her knee bleeding, her arms wrapped around a strange cat, and she hadn't known that her smile was about to pull her into a world she had never imagined. Now she was wearing a cream cashmere sweater, her brown hair clean and loose over her shoulders, her knee no longer scraped. And on the grass in front of her, Bree Langston, 5.5 years old, was sitting cross-legged, feeding Shadow and Clover on the grass while explaining to the 2 cats that the cherry blossoms were falling because the tree was changing into new clothes, and Shadow should stop eating the petals because flowers weren't food, even if they looked like candy. Bree still spoke strangely sometimes. She still called clouds by name, still believed flowers had feelings, still spoke to Shadow and Clover as though the 2 cats understood every word. But she laughed more. She laughed every morning when she ran into Felicity's room, laughed when she picked up pancake for Shadow to smell, laughed when Mr. Tall in the garden grew new leaves, and she said he was growing hair. And more of what she said made sense, had a beginning and an end, had subjects and verbs, had logic adults could follow, even though it still carried Bree's own private colors. Dr. Whitfield called it recovery through emotional connection. In his report to Emmerich, he said Bree didn't need anyone to fix her, didn't need anyone to drag her back to reality. She needed someone willing to step into her world, live there with her, until she was ready to step out on her own. Felicity had done that without anyone teaching her, without a degree, without technique. She had done it with the instinct of someone who had once been left behind by the whole world and knew what that feeling looked like from the inside. Familiar footsteps sounded on the brick path. Emmerich sat down beside her, not leaving a gap the way he had in the first weeks, but close, shoulder touching shoulder, thigh almost touching thigh, as naturally as though he had been sitting beside her on this stone bench all his life. 2 bodyguards stood 20 steps away, close enough to protect, far enough not to hear. Bree looked up from the grass, saw her father, and her eyes lit up. "Daddy, I want to buy ice cream for Mother Fell. Mother Fell likes strawberry ice cream." Emmerich took out his wallet and handed Bree a bill. Bree took the money, picked up Clover, and ran toward the ice cream cart at the end of the path. Finn followed right behind her, his 40-year-old face cold as stone, his eyes sweeping every direction with the habits of a veteran, but his right hand holding the pink Hello Kitty purse Bree had asked him to carry because she said it was too heavy for her. That image, a man who looked like a professional assassin holding a Hello Kitty purse while chasing after a 5-year-old child carrying a cat, was something Felicity would remember for a very long time. She laughed, and Emmerich watched her laugh, and the silence between them was no longer heavy or full of calculation, but light, warm, like the kind of silence only people who didn't need words to understand each other could have. "Do you regret it?" Emmerich's voice was low and gentle, not the voice of a crime boss, but the voice of a man sitting beside a woman on a stone bench in the middle of a park on a spring afternoon. "Regret what?" "Stepping into my world." "This world isn't clean, Felicity." Felicity looked at him, at the scar along his left jawbone, at the gray eyes that had been so cold 6 months ago they made FBI agents look away, and that now looked at her with something she had taken a long time to dare believe was real. "My old world, where my own blood threw me onto the street, wasn't clean either, Emmerich. At least in your world, someone actually wants me to stay." It was the first time she had called him by his name, not Mr. Langston, not the formal courtesy of respect, Emmerich, and Emmerich heard it, because he turned to look at her, and something in his eyes softened, only for a moment, brief enough that no one but her could see it, long enough for her to know it was real. Then he leaned down, in the middle of the park, in broad daylight, beneath the spring sunshine and the falling cherry blossoms, where anyone passing by could see the most feared man on the east coast of America being gentle with a woman, and he kissed her forehead, softly, slowly. Like a promise he didn't speak aloud because he had never been good with words. Bree ran back, holding 2 ice cream cones in both hands, with Clover scampering behind her and Finn following with the Hello Kitty purse, and a 3rd ice cream cone Bree had bought for him because she said Uncle Finn looked sad and needed ice cream. "Mother Fell, this ice cream tastes like a rainbow. I don't know what a rainbow tastes like, but it's really good." Felicity took the ice cream, smiling, and Bree climbed onto the bench to sit between her and Emmerich. Shadow jumped onto the little girl's lap, Clover jumped onto Felicity's, and the 4 of them, with the 2 cats, sat together on the Boston Common bench in the middle of a spring afternoon, eating rainbow-flavored ice cream, looking so much like an ordinary family that no passerby could have guessed. The man in the suit held an underworld empire stretching across half the East Coast, that the woman beside him had been sleeping beneath a bridge 6 months ago and feeding stray cats with her last piece of bread, and that the little girl between them, who had been trapped in a world of silence for 2 years, finally found her voice the moment she recognized the warmth in a stranger's smile. She stepped into their lives with torn shoes and a bleeding knee. She carried no wealth, no status, nothing at all except a smile that resembled someone they had lost. But that very smile did what power, money, and even violence couldn't do. It healed a child, tamed a beast, and proved that sometimes the person who has lost everything is the one who can give the most. Perhaps life has always been that way. The places where we belong aren't always the places where we're born, and the people we call family aren't always the ones who share our blood. Sometimes family is the strange child who calls you mother in the middle of a park, The frightening man who quietly gives you a cat because he saw you crying through a camera and never says a word about it. The housekeeper crying behind her apron because the child she loves has finally started smiling again. This story ends here. But the emotions it leaves behind, I believe, will stay with you for a little while longer. I would truly love to hear how you feel after listening. Which character touched your heart the most? Which moment brought tears to your eyes? Or what this story reminded you of in your own real life? Please share your feelings from deep within your heart in the comments below, because every comment you leave is the greatest motivation for us to keep telling more meaningful stories. If this story touched you, please press the like button and share this video with the people you love so they can listen too. And if you haven't subscribed to our channel yet, please subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss new and compelling stories every day. We sincerely thank you for taking the time to listen all the way to the very last minute. And we wish all of you watching this video good health, a joyful life, peace, and days filled with love and serenity. Goodbye, everyone, and see you again in the next video.